I'm proud to welcome here Elke Krasny. She came from Vienna and she is going to hold a lecture on urban curating. At the moment she's teaching at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna as a senior lecturer. As she told me, she's going to be a guest professor at the Technical University in Vienna next year. She has rich experiences as a curator and artist from Vienna, from Hong Kong, also from Canada, from Toronto, I guess. And at the moment, as far as I know, or what I was being able somehow to get hands-on was her exhibition in Architekturzentrum Wien called Right to Green, and which was also partly exhibited at the last Architectural Biennale in Venice. And she has published widely in magazines and also in editorial books of selected texts, and she is also an author of several monographies, I guess. So I'm glad to have you here. Welcome, and we are looking forward to your lecture.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very sorry. I don't speak any Czech, even though I have a Czech last name, so I can't live up to any expectations. I will share 3 projects with you today, which I worked on in the last years, recent projects. And the first image I chose was an image chosen with reference to the poster that announces the whole series. And it's also connected to work I did in Vancouver that was called Mapping the Neighborhood, when I was invited by the Audain Gallery in Vancouver to do a project there as visiting artist, visiting curator. And I hope I'm loud enough without a microphone. So if it's not, if it's too not loud enough, if it's too quiet, then just tell me and I'll pick up the microphone. But if not, I prefer to speak without it. So the image you're looking at is an image of the year 2006, specifically September 30th. And I think if we think of architectural history, implosions or things going up in smoke are very much part of an iconography. And I'm, of course, referring to Pruitt-Igoe, or I'm referring to the Twin Towers. And this is not what today's lecture is going to be about, but I think that things that disappear in order to make room for things to take the place of what was there before and go up in an implosion or an explosion are very much part of something we should theoretically and practically be aware when dealing with space. So back to 2006, September 30th. So what you're looking at is the implosion of the Woodwards building in Vancouver. The Woodwards was the oldest and largest department store in North America at some point. It was originally built in 1903 and was a landmark building of Vancouver. And then it went up in what you see here, a lot of smoke and destruction in 2006. So everything was blown up except for the oldest original portion of the Woodward structure. It was demolished with a rollover implosion by Pacific blasting, which signaled the beginning of the construction of the new complex of buildings. And the reason why I'm showing you this image is that I was invited to work in a gallery space, the Audain Gallery, that is actually housed in the Woodwards building. So the Simon Fraser University moved to the downtown east side in Vancouver, to the downtown campus. And of course, you're probably all aware that there has been a lot of critical and theoretical work on how art and gentrification have a joint, let's say, a joint history, a joint coming into being. I think a lot less critical work has been done on how education and universities are major driving forces of gentrification processes. So that's something that is sort of hidden in this image. So the space where I was invited to work as an artist in residence had a very difficult and complex history of coming into being. This is the construction site of the Woodward site. And if you go on Wikipedia, these three images are the Wikipedia images that you will find. So this is what it looks like today. 43 towers, and around the residential area, as I said before, part of it is used by the Simon Fraser University. There's also retail and a fraction of the social housing that was originally intended or demanded to be there. And there's also a community center about which I will speak a bit more at the end of the first part of my lecture. I'm going back in history now. So this is like a 2012 image of the Woodwards building. This is prior to construction. This is 2006. And this is what happened in 2002. So in 1993, the Woodwards discontinued to be a department store. You might probably know the reasons. So what happened to a lot of downtown retail, not just in North America, but also in Europe, is that suburban malls took over, and then consequently the downtowns dilapidated or lost the power of consumption, if you will. And then the structure sat empty for many years due to the fact that the originally planned restructuring fell through. It was then bought by the province, British Columbia, and then eventually it was bought by the city of Vancouver. So a lot of these big structures around the world have similar histories. They fall into something that you could call sleep, and then they have to be woken up again to go towards the future. And in this case, what woke them up, their wake-up call, so to speak, was a group of activists and squatters squatting the Woodwards building and demanding that it should be used for social housing. What I probably should add as a background information to understand the context better is that the downtown east side is the poorest postal code of all of Canada. So even though Vancouver is a very rich city overall, the downtown is the poor part, not just of Vancouver, but the poorest part of all of Canada. And it's very much marked by prostitution, drug abuse, high crime rate, and of course poverty, homelessness, and struggles for the right to housing. So what happened is that people squatted the Woodward building, and it's called the Wood Squad. There's also a book about that out. They were in the building for a week, and then the police made them leave. And then they turned to the sidewalks surrounding the building. This is the W that stands for the Woodwards propped up on an Eiffel Tower. That was the landmark of the structure and was then returned afterwards. Oh, I'm missing one image. Okay. So what I wanted to show you after the people on the sidewalk is people camping in tents. So for 3 months they squatted the vicinity, the neighborhood, so you only see one tent here, but I wanted to show you that it actually became something like a tent city. And their struggles to the right of housing actually moved forward, that it was then reconstructed, that it was then turned into what you saw at the beginning, this 43 high-rise building, 43-story high-rise building. But of course, the story didn't really have a happy end because it didn't become social housing and cultural use the way the squatters demanded it. but it very much became private property, retail that sort of keeps out the community and not invites the people in, with an atrium or plaza where there is a basketball hoop that is rarely used by the community. And there is also a cultural center that, again, didn't quite meet the expectations of what the demands actually were. This is, as I pointed out before, the W standing for woodwards propped up on the Eiffel Tower. And I'm not going to do a detailed iconographic analysis of this image, but I think it is very interesting that a structure that represented engineering intelligence and was part of the World Fair in Paris in the late 19th century was then something that represented a promise of modernity. And the W here is sort of the W that was reinstalled after the building was finished. And the people who hold this W in their hands so that it can be installed on top of this Eiffel Tower, Squamish people. So a lot of the land in Vancouver is what Canadians call unceded land. That means that there was never a treaty that the land was taken from the First Nations or First Peoples, as they're called. And unceded land means that it's actually illegal to build there, that there was never a legal structure over the land ownership, that the land is still used in a way that you could say is extra legal, if you will. So informality or extra legality, I think we should reconsider to think about it in different scales. So the informal is not just the peripheries of cities where informal structures like slums are sprawling, but informality, or I prefer the word extra legality, actually can happen on very different scales. So the Squamish presenting the W to be reinstalled is a gesture of what Canadians call reconciliation, so that they agree to the land being used the way it is used today. Or at least in this representative gesture, they agree to that. And the way the lecture is composed, the Squamish being introduced here have to do with the fact that in the exhibition I did there, Squamish played a role as a language, and I will go into the process of the urban curatorial project I did there in more detail now. So what you're looking at here is actually the window of the Audain Gallery that is part of the Woodwards complex that I introduced to you now, so that you have a little bit of urban history of Vancouver, but also the immediate spatial and physical context of the place I was working in and was invited to work with. And the way we worked was what different leftist, feminist, and Marxist theorists called coalition politics. So on one hand, I was invited by an art space, and they have a program of inviting international artists or curators to come in and to be a visiting artist. So most of the people who conventionally come in with a work they had done in the past and then install it there and then use the time they have in Vancouver to work on something new or to not work at all but to be in residence, to think about future projects. The way I work, I'm not a very I don't do material productions that result in physical works very often. A lot of my work is very text-based, and it comes into being through collaboration or working together with others. And in this case, the collaboration I entered into was with a group of women from the downtown East Side Women's Center. So they founded their center in 1973. And it was a center founded by mostly Squamish and Cree women, so First Nation women, but also elderly Chinese women and a lot of other people who felt that such a center was needed. What they provide is basic support to women who are conflicted in their lives because of poverty, drug abuse, prostitution, and what they offer is health services, legal advice with regard to your status, but also to right to housing. So a lot of the things that we associate conventionally with the welfare state, you could say, are provided by this center. They started out as a very small center with one social worker and a group of 7 or 8 activist women who invested themselves in forming the centers, what I would call bottom-up urbanism, and have now grown into a group of more than 12 social workers and women who go there during the day. What I would like to add is that this is not a center for homeless people where they can have a shelter overnight, so that it's strictly during the day. They are inclusive but also restrictive, so they are open to women and to queers and transgender people, but they're not open to men. The third thing I would like to add is that I didn't take any photographs of the center itself. What I will show you is the exhibition we worked on together, but you will not see any of the people with whom I worked. And I did that for a reason. So on the downtown east side in Vancouver, as I said, is under major gentrification processes. It's like a pressure cooker of gentrification. But due to the fact that the university moved there, it has also become, you could say, a laboratory for artists, urbanists, anthropologists, sociologists. So a lot of PhDs come out of the downtown east side. And activist groups, like the people with whom I worked, have coined the motto or the demand, no representation about us without us. So they do not want to become the ones who just serve another PhD or another exhibition project or another photographic exploration without having some benefit from that or without being part of the making of it. And I think that's, even though they didn't specifically address architects, because most of the people who work with them are not architects, but as I said before, artists or anthropologists or urbanists, I think that's something that theoretically and methodologically is also interesting to think about in terms of architecture. So what would that be? No space for us without us, or how would one translate a demand like that? So there will be no photographs of the women I've worked with, but I would like to describe what you first see when you enter the center. So when you enter the center, which is not in an exemplary building, it's a very commonplace or ordinary building, is a table that is set up that holds different items, books, candles that are lit, other devotionalia. And they all commemorate people who have passed away recently. So it's a place where there is a lot of grief and a lot of pain, you could say, where people have to deal with the fact that members of their community are dying because they die because they freeze to death or they overdose or for any other number of reasons that have to do with the life they are leading or the life they cope with. So I was there all together for almost 3 months, going back and forth between Vienna and Vancouver. And the first 3 weeks, I was just there with them. I tried to understand better how they work, what they do, why the women go there, but also in a way that they could get to know me. And First Nation people, they would not enter in a collaboration unless they agreed to it. So it was nothing that I could convince them to work with me. They make their choices. So if they had chosen not to work together, that would have been a choice I would also have had to accept. And after this time of just having time together or of not just producing together in a space, but producing time together. We came to an understanding that it would be interesting to see if we could map their history, but not for a historiographic or for the sake of historiography, but for the sake of something oriented towards their future in this gentrification pressure cooker. And the way we did is that we went through all the newsletters that the center had produced ever since 1973. So originally, of course, that was pre-digital time. So originally they had a printed newsletter, and then they gradually moved to a newsletter that they published online. So the three languages here are also the languages representing the center. So interestingly enough, even though Canada is, of course, officially a bilingual country where everything has to be in English and in French, French was not a language the women of the center named. What they named was, as I said before, Squamish, then Chinese, and of course English. And all the quotes that they picked out was their choice. So they went through their newsletters and took out the quotes that were demands of protest marches of the past, that were demands they had made onto the community itself. So if there is a claim like no racism, it's not just a claim that would be oriented towards the larger downtown east side or towards people living in Vancouver, but a lot more towards dealing with their internal racism between First Nations, Chinese, Caucasian people. The space itself is very white cubey, so it's one of these art spaces that you all know. And I didn't choose to counteract this aesthetic. So the aesthetic choices were my choices. So it was very much a collaboration, and all the content they chose was their choice. But the aesthetic choice in representing it as a text-based installation was something I suggested to them. And I would think that it's not a choice they would have made on their own. So for them it was something that they hadn't conceived of before, that there is contemporary art that actually works with text on a wall. So what we did together was look at a lot of other artists who have, contemporary artists who worked with writing or text-based installations in order to introduce that this is not something that is completely out of the context, how text-based installations are being represented in an art context. At the same time, I would say it wasn't, quote-unquote, just an art installation, but it was something that was very much used by different communities of the downtown east side when it was in the gallery. So there were other activist groups who came in and used the space very much with the claims and demands as their foreground or background. And the installation in the middle, the plywood parts that hold a collection of videos was done by a group of artists called Des Media, and they worked around the time when the Wood Squat happened and a little later, so the first 5 years of the 21st century, 2000 to 2005. And interestingly enough, they still worked with this, at the time, already very outdated technology of videotapes. And what they did was what you could call activist journalism, community-based journalism. They did a lot of documentation on the urban transformation processes happening. So that's another strand of my research I'm very interested in. How is urban transformation actually captured? I mean, who are the people who write about transformation while it happens, and from which perspective? Who is telling the story of urban transformation? Is it told from let's say, the official city's perspective? Is it told from an investor's perspective? Is it told from activists' perspectives? Is it told from people who intend to move in there? Or is it not told from any one perspective at all, but something that appears to be a neutral perspective? So it's something I find very challenging. Where do we actually read and write about urban transformation while it's happening, not just in retrospect? And that's the reason why I also invited this media to become part of the exhibition. But I had a more urgent reason than that. Because one of the artists / activists who was part of this media had sort of censored the use of the archive. So he was in a lot of these videos, and he said he didn't like the way he was represented in it, or the opinion he had at the time was not the opinion he still had today. So he didn't want any of this archive to become publicly used any longer. So I think you have this very challenging situation of urban transformation and its archive, and on the other hand, nobody's allowed to see it, nobody's allowed to witness it. So I sort of convinced them or talked them into exhibiting the archive as an archive that you were not allowed to use. So it was there, and at the same time it was not accessible, or it was not there. And the third thing I asked them to do is, and many of you might be familiar with Chantal Mouffe and her definition or writing and working on the political, which she always defines from this perspective of the agon, of the agonistic, so something that moves forward in, you could say, conflict. So I invited the Des Media artists, activists to host a public gathering each week the exhibition was on, and to discuss in public, so to turn the space of the gallery into a public space to decide collectively the future of this archive. Because I felt it was not okay that one voice decided what should happen with an archive that had been produced collectively. But then you also have to respect that someone doesn't want to be seen anymore. So I think it's a situation where working on this situation in a space where the non-accessibility of the archive was present to witness any future decisions was something that created the gallery as public time and public space. Another part of the whole process was that I was, as an invited artist, you have the opportunity to work with students. So in this case, I've worked with contemporary art students of the Simon Fraser University, and invited them to think about what they would like to contribute to the project. And interestingly enough, it was actually the only thing I had in mind before going there. So when I first decided to work together with the Downtown East Side Women's Center, the only thing I had in mind as a preparation was that I would actually like to do a collective library. And it turned out that the library of the center had actually been stolen. I mean, not all the books at the same time, but they sort of petered off and disappeared because people took a liking or turned it into cash or did whatever with it. And the students then did a consultation, if you will, or a participatory process where they asked the women what kind of books they would like to have. And the books they named were very different. So they wanted books on law, on housing rights, on indigenous rights. They wanted poetry books. There's a very long and intensive critical poetry tradition along the North American West Coast. But they also demanded books about nature and history. So the students and I together, we sort of sourced books. And then you end up calling libraries, bookstores, local publishing houses in order to start a collection. And the furniture you see was built for the exhibition, and it's, again, a historical reference of resistance, this time not to the wood squad, but to the history of the Simon Fraser University that had a very turbulent student protest history in 1968, 1969. And so the furniture of that time was actually the furniture I went back to in order to have something like a rolling library. So you could say there are historical references built into that that might not be legible at first glance, and maybe they don't become legible ever to some of the people who go there or who visit an exhibition, but that for me, as a curator working on that, were important to embed into the space as a reference to site specificity of a continuance of struggles. I guess another issue that has, like the urban transformation and its witnessing or its contemporary historiography, another question that has been driving my thinking and working is what happens after a strike or what happens after a protest? Because there's, at the Academy, as you might remember, I don't know if you were there at the time, but there was a protest in which not the architecture students, but most of the other students were very actively involved. And I teach there at two different departments, and the art and education department where I teach was at the forefront of the strike. And then after the strike, or immediately the next 2 semesters, you could say all the knowledge that was produced during the strike, all the, let's say, collectivity, the energy, the political organizing, it sort of vanished, it disappeared. So the memory, both written, visual, but a lot more the lived memory as a strategy is what I'm interested in, sort of disappeared. So in a way, I brought this experience to working with the women there. And when you're part of a university where you learn about the strikes that happened there in the past, I thought it would be interesting to sort of integrate that by way of design. So in a way, design can become a reference, or design can carry this, and not just something you put in words, or you talk about, or you write. And the last, so to speak, I'm going down in scale. So first we are at the wall, then we go to the scale of furniture that is moving, and now we are at the scale of ex libris. So what the students did together with the women of the center is to say, in case our books get stolen again or disappear, we would like to have a visual trace in the books to tell the people who will be the future owners where they actually came from. So again, they went into the archive, and they mostly, interestingly enough, there seems to be an ongoing exploration of the 1970s. So mostly they went back to images that the Women's Center had produced in the 1970s in collaboration with artists at the time, and they recycled or reused them to become part of the books as ex libris. And this was the entrance to the gallery. So what I would like to explain is that the downtown East Side Women's Center is 500 meters from the Simon Fraser University and the Woodwards building. But 500 meters can be a very long distance that is not bridged if you feel that you do not belong to either of these spaces. So what I'm trying to say is that the students I worked with would probably never have visited the downtown East Side Women's Center had it not been for the project. And the women from the center would not have gone to the Woodwards building for a variety of reasons that kept them out. And one of them is actually very spatial. So you could say prevention of access by design is something that happens very often. The way the entrances were designed were actually indicating to a lot of groups that they were not welcome there. But not only prevention of access by design, there's also, of course, as you know, in most American universities, there are security guards who will monitor the entrance or who enters the building. And a lot of the women just don't conform with abled bodies, so they would be on crutches or electro-scooters in order to move. So you could say that their bodies and their appearance, when they appear in public, like Hannah Arendt speaks of public appearance, sort of excluded them from entering. And we worked very much in the gallery space many times in order to create a different sense of meaning to show one's work there or to make it accessible. And the entrance here actually holds a collection of different textiles that the students had sourced, because that's another thing that the women had demanded, not just the books, but they also do a lot of craft work. So when you entered, you saw this mapping the everyday neighborhood claims for the future. We never did a catalog or a book, not because I wouldn't have wanted to, but just because there wasn't enough budget or not enough resources, and I sort of used the resources in a way that they all went towards the women's center. So when we would get together, there would always, so food is very important to the women at the center, so there would always be food. So I used the budget for things that you cannot see, because it was eaten up, because it was used for other things that have to do with sociability, conviviality, things that you do when you work together for a longer period of time. But that doesn't necessarily result in a visible, tangible object. We did a lot of programming. I tend to over-program, so we kind of had something going on almost every day. The only collaboration in the programming I want to point out is that we initiated a reading group, like a theory reading group, to look at how have people dealt with issues of gentrification, involvement of the arts, but also issues of agency from a theoretical level. And I guess what I'm proud of is that the theory group wasn't just the people from around the art scene or the university, but that 3 of the women from the center decided to become part of the reading group. And they always met in different places, sometimes in the gallery space, but also in different places. And before going to my next project, I would like to go back to these images that you've seen before, providing the context. And I would like to read to you, and you can find that online also. It's Great Coast Anarchist News, and there's a person called Isaac Oman who writes about the Wood Squad Woodward gentrification in the downtown East Side. And I would like to quote from the text here. So I'm starting in the middle of a text, but I think, or I hope it will still work. Woodward's developers' major concession with regard to the downtown East Side neighborhood, other than fractional social housing, was a community space. So at the beginning, they demanded that 30% should be social housing. In fact, it's only 15%, and a lot of it is also not going to the people who actually claimed that it should go to them. Back to the community space. A call was put to community groups to create this space. Of 4 main groups that attended these consultations, 3 pulled out and left just 1 to take the space. The group, known at the time as Creative Technology, became W2 Community Media Arts. The place was designed to fool, said Jim Carrico, who represented one of the many smaller organizations making up the community groups involved with the consultations. So what the activists had arrived at is that a lot of consultations were actually held as to what should go in there. But what I'm reading to you now is that the consultations did not lead to actually implementing what they had demanded. And I'm quoting this Jim Carrico again. The whole building was designed to not have real mixing. So I guess mixing has been for decades the default when architects and urbanists speak about urban futures, as if mixing itself were something quote-unquote good. It's almost an ethical, not just an economic demand that you should mix. And I come from a city that has like this celebration of mixing. So Vienna is very much obsessed with a space that is mixed socially is a good space. So again, here we encounter this, you could say, quote-unquote, ideology of mixing. The whole building was designed to not have real mixing. It was built into the architecture. And this is the sentence I find most remarkable. How do you build not mixing into the architecture? For us, the main floor was off limits. We were given a smaller space. It was not about helping the groups involved. The groups had to come up with the money to finish the space. So there was both spatial issues but also financial issues. As a result of these perceived exclusions, Carrico left the consultation. W2 has burgeoned, has bloomed into a number of projects, including a cafe, a meeting space, an art society, and a radio show on a co-op radio. So I think if you read this, it's also almost paradigmatic that a lot of social spaces have all these functions that were named here. A cafe is a meeting space where you don't have to consume anything, an art society, and a radio to make things public. It has also become a controversial space because of its existence in the downtown East Side. We had fundraising events to keep W2 running, said Donna Chen, the organization's former volunteer coordinator. We had majority middle-class white males partying in the downtown East Side. How much is this benefiting of W2's mission and mandate? Strategies like this have had repercussions from the downtown East Side community. So the reason why I'm reading this to you is that I wanted to emphasize or to underline how difficult it actually is to work in situations that are contested for many reasons, and that you always, every decision you take, you side with somebody in the process. But I would like to emphasize that there is no such thing as a neutral position, and that if you enter and you are aware that the university is part of the gentrification process, what does that then mean, that you collaborate with someone who actually perceives the university as the enemy? So I think it's not an easy thing, and I don't think that any of the things we tried to do was moving over these contradictions, but I think it's something that can always be held against such a project, which doesn't prevent me from doing things. I think it's always better to do than not to do. I don't believe that self-censorship is the way one should act. But I think it's extremely difficult to work in, and that's the title of your lecture series, contested spaces. And the last thing I want to share about the downtown East Side Vancouver story is finally about the architect who planned the building. Gregory Enriquez, he's a well-known, very well-known architect. And when you go to his website, but also to the Woodward's entry in Wikipedia, what you will read is that Woodward's redevelopment is socially inclusive. It's unprecedented in Canada in its scale, in its humanitarian aspirations, and its complexity. And now I'm quoting the architect himself. He says that meaningful architecture must be a poetic expression of social justice. And I think given what you learn when you actually navigate the space, when you use it both physically and mentally, but also politically and emotionally, is that it doesn't live up to these expectations. So the way he speaks about his practice, both in writing but also in his lectures, that it's based on a politics and ethics of justice. And I'm not saying that he doesn't want to achieve that. I guess the question I'm having is, how could one achieve such a space under neoliberal market conditions that are anything but easy when you do redevelopment? So I kind of leave it open-ended here because I don't think it's a question that any one person has an answer to, but I think it's a question that in a way too often is not even asked as a question or circumvented. And I would now like to go to the second part. And you mentioned before that I did an exhibition in Vienna called Hands-on Urbanism, The Right to Green. The images I'm sharing with you are not from the Vienna installation, but from the installation at the Museum for Contemporary Art in Leipzig. So what I find very interesting is that hands-on urbanism has been shown in different contexts. It was shown in an architecture center, it was shown in a contemporary art space, and it has been shown in a couple of different spaces that deal with ecology, human rights, urbanization. So it's actually the only project I ever did that transgressed specific spaces. And I found that very interesting from a curatorial standpoint. What does that mean that audiences then shift, or that, as far as my understanding is, an art audience might differ from an architecture audience, but then also there could be institutions that through such an exhibition open up to different debates or different audiences. For example, in Leipzig, we teamed up with the Heinrich Böll Foundation and also with local activists, with local policymakers, with the city administration to have a series of workshops. So again, there were a lot of things like the dinners in Vancouver going on that are not visible, but from my practice are very much part of urban curating. So there are always parts that become an exhibition that take on form, where the form finding is a very important part of it. But there are other things that are immaterial or intangible, which I find equally important. Hands-on urbanism actually started in the present, and then from there it became a historiographic exploration. What I mean by that is that in 2006, 2007, I traveled a lot for a project I was working on at the time that didn't have anything to do with hands-on urbanism or the right to green. But wherever I went, each continent, there was green sprouting, you could say. So it was a time where guerrilla gardening, community gardens, urban agriculture seemed to be the thing to do. And I began to ask myself, why now? I mean, why is there such a desire, a necessity, a need, a yearning, a political agreement, an activist agreement that a community garden is the right thing to do? Very often almost with an inbuilt, quote-unquote, ideology that it's part of making the world a better place. And as much as I would like to believe that, and I guess to a little degree, I would still believe that there are ways to make the world a better place, but I'm not as idealistic any longer as I would like to be. So from a theoretical standpoint, I cannot believe that the garden can live up to these expectations that are planted into it. And also, the history of gardening is a lot more complex and conflicted than just this one strand of the idealized community garden. If we think of prisoners that are forced to work in gardens, if we think of school gardens, if we think of fascist forced labor in concentration camps with gardens, if we think of what the United States do today with prisoners and their gardens, there is a lot more to the garden than just this emancipatory side that is very often celebrated. So in looking at the right to green from a contemporary perspective, I then went back in history to do a research on very different places of the world to understand how one can understand urbanization processes through the lens of gardening in the tension or conflict between the rural and the urban that is always part of urbanization, and also issues of self-organization. And I guess it also led me to, in a way, become weary of bottom-up and top-down. So I didn't choose the title bottom-up urbanism because I think it still very much implies that there has to be a bottom-up and a top-down. I'm not saying there is not. I think the reality in very many places still is like that. But I chose the term hands-on because it means both, something you physically do with your hands, but also something you choose to participate in. So as you can see, what happened with the design in this exhibition is that all the originals, if you will, were actually the display. So all the construction fences were actually originals that went back to a construction site. All the elements you could sit on were actually recycled from former exhibitions of the Museum for Contemporary Art in Leipzig, and the whole installation was text-based and image-based. So I kind of played with this, what is the original and what is not the original? What does it mean when you use a construction fence that is actually bent and crooked as a display unit? What does it mean when you bring this into an exhibition space? How do you then relate to processes of urbanization? Because of course construction fences, they mark the territories where the urban is changing, but they also very often block from sight what you're not supposed to see. So when you think, for example, of sports events like the Olympics or sports events that were held in Belgrade, so then construction site fences and a lot of posters over it were used to block off-site all the Roma settlements. So I think the construction site fence is a very ambivalent tool. And I wanted to make it see-through, as if you could see through these processes of urbanization. Well, I'm not sure you can actually see through them in this very literal sense. All in all, there are 22 different case studies that I researched. Most of them are based on field research, so I would have time in the field, do interviews, do historiographic research. In some cases, I had researchers who assisted me and helped. And the one case study that I would like to go into a little more detail is in Hong Kong, in Mapopo village. And I chose this one because it connects to something I said at the very beginning. If you remember, I talked about First Nations and Squamish people and land ownership and land rights. So in this part of Hong Kong called the New Territories, the indigenous populations called Punti, they had specific land rights granted to them by the British Empire. And the reason for the very complex situation that is happening in one of these last villages of Hong Kong has to do with this long history of complex issues around land ownership. So the people who actually owned the land, because they were granted more land ownership rights than others in Hong Kong, most of them have left to other parts of what used to be the British Empire. So they live in the UK or in Canada or in Australia. They're not there any longer. And the people who moved there, most of them after World War II or in the 1970s, and their descendants who actually built what we oftentimes call informal buildings, like the ones you see in the foreground. They are mostly from mainland China and moved to Hong Kong, as I said, after World War II in the 1970s. And I want to point out two things. One is that it's less informal than it seems to be. So, for example, the cladding that you see is something that was actually a regulation of the British Empire, that all these farmhouses had to be clad like that. And the other thing I would like to point out is if you search long enough, there's always somebody who is an architect in the story of building. So in this case, it took a while to locate the architect, but he was there nonetheless. When we did field research, and I had Xu Mei Huyang, who is a PhD candidate in Taipei and works on tenants' rights in Hong Kong, and I ran into her when I was in Hong Kong, and she agreed to help me with translation. When we did research in Mapopo village, we found the person who actually built most of these houses. So he was a builder who had moved there with his family from China, and then moved on to Malaysia. And what he did in Malaysia is, and now the architect comes into play, he had forgotten the name of the architect, but the architect built houses for the Chinese expat community in Malaysia. So he designed houses that would A, express that they're Chinese, and B, be adapted to the Malaysian climate. And this is what this person then brought back to Hong Kong. So all the informal buildings that were built incrementally over time, step by step, added or reduced according to the needs of the people living in there, were actually built by him. And in the book Hands on Urbanism, there's a larger essay on him and on his practice and how he worked and what he did. So you could say he is part of an architectural history that most likely doesn't get narrated normally. The other thing I would like to point out is that the policies and the developers that are currently buying up all the land there and want to develop it so that it becomes both commercial and residential want to implement a green development. And this is, I don't even have a word how to describe what one feels, because when you stand there, you think it doesn't get any greener than the way it is right now. I mean, there's natural ventilation. You don't see any air condition in these houses, which is unusual for any place in Hong Kong. You can say that it's a very self-sustaining community. The people who live in the high-rises on the other side of the street, they actually come down. Some have started to do urban gardening there as well. So there is a local farmers market. If you think of closed local cycles, though I'm not totally fond of closed local cycles. I'm very skeptical about that. But if one were to propagate that, that would be an ideal example to show. So what does that mean? That green has become the same thing as whitewashing, in a way, greenwashing. This is what happens when the Punti, who originally lived there, sell their land. But of course the houses were only built by the people who actually live there. So you see immediately that there is a huge conflict between the ones who own the land and the ones who actually tend the land or farm the land. And most of the people who lose their homes don't get any recompensation because it goes to the people who are the landowners. And what's happening there at the moment is that a group of people from Hong Kong who are designers, students, architects, artists, actually moved to Mapopo village. Some of them moved, some of them go there to work as part-time urban farmers in order to keep the resistance alive as long as possible. This photograph shows the urban farmers upon graduation, and the person in the middle with the gray suit is also the person who I invited then to Vienna to come and give a lecture about the work they do there. I would like to speak about participation in a bit of a roundabout way here. So a lot of times we think about participation, or we might think about participation as something that municipalities, governments, housing corporations invite residents or future residents to partake in. In this case, it was quite the other way around. The people who are the villagers or who came to support the villagers invited the municipality to participate in a consultation process of how to proceed that they could keep maybe at least part of the village. Very important for most of the case studies I chose was collective space, a space that is also multi-use or multi-purpose, if you will. So again, this is a very unassuming space, but it serves as the center for the local farmers market. There are different consultations taking place in their political consultations. It serves as a place for workshop, for education, for learning, but also where the community of farmers has a place to get together. The woman wearing the apron is Becky Au, and she's actually the initiator of the whole Mapopo village resistance, and the older lady in the foreground is her grandmother, who is actually the person who lives in this house. So the two of them are the ones who set this process of mini ruralization, if you will, or urbanization in motion. And this is Becky Au at work. And I think what I like about it is that it shows a contemporary farmer. So she was somebody who studied economics in Hong Kong, worked in Hong Kong Central for many years, and then returned to become a farmer. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I hope it's self-explanatory why I like it. Just looking at the time. So very, very briefly, when you work as a curator who goes places to do research or to work with people, many times you don't do that in your own neighborhood. I haven't done too many projects very close to home recently, but I would like to share one. It's on the street where I actually live, and I think it's more complicated if you work at home than if you travel to work for many reasons, because I think a lot of people in my generation that started out in the late 80s to invent or do things invented this generation project. So you do one project after the other. And I think the project becomes kind of the basis of work. So in the new spirit of capitalism, the project-based polis has been described very lucidly. And even though I would probably say critically, I stand for a very different type of work Nonetheless, the project has been the basis of the way I'm working as a curator for a long time. When you work in your own neighborhood, a project is never finished. I mean, it can go on forever. So it makes it a lot more difficult to stop. And it doesn't make it easier to begin. So all this said, I don't regret having worked in the street where I live. I have a completely different understanding of the neighborhood, and I hope that I could meaningfully contribute to things that are complicated there. So the reason why I chose to do an urban project in the Lerchenfelderstraße is that when I moved there about 10 years ago, most of the people whom I told that I just moved there said, how could you ever have moved into such a dying street? So A, of course, I don't want to live in a dying street, but B, I find it extremely derogatory to tell someone you live in a place that dies. I mean, we shouldn't talk about, I don't want to moralize, but I think it's not at all, but I think it's very difficult if a mindset already always addresses a certain part of the city as dying or not functioning or to be given up. So of course this is not a poor area. It's very close to the center, but it's sort of one of those streets that don't work well. It used to be, I don't know if the word even exists in English, but it used to be called a shopping street. I don't know if you have an equivalent here, but I think the way Central European cities work, they always have these streets that are dedicated to shopping. So the ground floor is supposed to be lively. There is supposed to be urban life, and it's marked by this hybrid situation between public and private. And what I'm referring to is, of course, small stores where you go in and out. So where the threshold is something that actually leads you into these houses that in the end are just like here, sit flush with the sidewalk. And in this street, there's a lot of turnover, a lot of empty stores, but there's also a lot of people who do work there every day. A lot of them happen to be immigrants, not what is oftentimes called an ethnic community, that the immigrants come from one place in the world, but very individual immigrants from Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Thailand, the Czech Republic, who actually came in the late 1960s when I talked with them, ex-Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth, Portugal, whatever. So what I was interested in when I worked on the street is to, in a way, it was a very conceptual thought. I was thinking, all these people who work here, they have kilometers and kilometers between where they are now and the homes they originally left. So if I were to think the street spatially in extension, it's A, very transnational, and B, very, very long. So the physical site is 2.2 kilometers, but if you were to map all the distances of people migrating, it would be a very, very long street. And that's what I was interested in. And also to create, you could say, a document or a series of documents of urban transformation that is ongoing, difficult, but normally not worthwhile reporting about, because it's neither dramatic enough nor grandiose enough. It's too mediocre. So I think things that are too close to normal, even though they don't quite function very well, are not the things that are observed, or they are understudied, if you will. And it resulted in an exhibition and a series of talks and walks and a symposium that we did at the, you might know it, the 25 Hours Hotel when it was still under construction. It's the hotel at the very end of the street that Erich Bernard and his team have realized. It has this glass atrium, and it was still under construction when we used it for a symposium with people from the street, but also people like Bert Thijs, who have a very critical anti-gentrification anarchist art practice in Milano, local politicians, so people who might normally not meet in one space. And we invited them to speak and present the future of such places. So when you look at the book, and I will circulate it, that's the last thing I want to share. So the bottom is always the interview with, so there are 220 people who are store owners there, and 30 of them agreed to be interviewed and to share their stops in their life, or the places where they studied, worked. So I only asked about these things that are, you could say, public record. Where did you go to school? Where did you study? A lot of them studied, so that, I have to say, came as a surprise to me, that a lot of the people who open stores have actually academic degrees, which has to do, I mean, it shouldn't be surprising, it has to do with the legal situation that in a lot of EU countries, third state diplomas are without nostrification, so you cannot be a doctor even though you're a doctor, or you cannot be an engineer even though you're an engineer. So these are kind of their biographies. This is a photo documentation we did of the street, and all the objects that are mobile, or all the beings that are mobile, like human beings or dogs that happen to be out, are cut out. So it's kind of a frozen moment one afternoon in August when we did this. And then on the upper part there are essays on urbanization, gentrification, but also on, you could say, relatives of this street. So when I did this research, I contacted other people who worked on comparable streets in Zagreb and in Brémách and in Hamburg and other places, and invited them to contribute. So I would like to circulate this and just conclude with how I tried to introduce this very last project into which I don't want to go in great detail, but that it's kind of the, you could say, the artist curator as traveler was the first two projects, and then the curator doing homework was kind of the last project. Yeah, I guess I spoke a little longer than I had planned to. I'm grateful that you didn't leave. And there is, as far as I know, time for questions and answers. Part of it is in English, so there are English summaries of all the essays, and all the interviews are both English and German. But I can leave it here. I mean, it's if you would like to have it in your library, I can. I would like to sell it to others who. It's okay. On 7th and 8th, it shares 2 districts. It's right behind the museum's quarter.
So maybe before the students
bombard me with lots of questions.
Can you maybe explain a little bit more the situation in the first part of the presentation around the remote power? I mean, maybe it's not, maybe it's clear, but anyway, just to help us understand the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you can tell us a little bit more how the tower was squatted, why it was squatted, how the university, I mean, became the main gentrificator, main, let's say, accelerator of the gentrification. When it comes that the police, it was the moment when the police started to intervene in the squatting process. Can you explain a little bit more the situation?
I'll try, yeah. So there's a book out on that called Wood Squat, and it gives a detailed account of the whole history. So if you're really thoroughly interested, I mean, I would consult that. They squatted it because when the Woodward's department store was closed in 1993, there was a plan that it should become housing. And then for reasons of lack of finances, it just sat empty. So the people who squatted it wanted to create a manifestation of a demand that social housing in the downtown east side was very much what was needed. So in a way, their squatting forced the city to act. So they bought the property back from a developer who hadn't developed. So first, the province of British Columbia bought it back, and then the city of Vancouver bought it back for, I think, $5 million. And then together with a group of developers, they started to develop this $400 million project. So you could say, on one hand, the very fact that it was squatted for a week inside, and then the police sort of made everybody leave, and then they squatted the vicinity on the sidewalk. Actually,
so the squatting was kind of manifestation.
A manifestation of the need for housing. You could say, I mean, like the 2000s witnessed a lot of right to the city movements. A very conscious political action. But you could say they didn't get what they wanted. I think this is what I tried to explain. Even though they were successful, that they actually triggered the city to act and to create this whole financial structure around it, that it came into being. Maybe they were too successful, because what in the end came into being is, of course, not social housing, or is not community spaces, or if it is, it has the semblance of an atrium that so Vancouver, it rains like, I don't know, half the year or even more. So a covered space where you can play basketball is very much a public space that is needed. But the people who are the people out on the street, they would never enter that space. So you could say they succeeded because there is a public space that appears to be public. I think there's this acronym POP, privately owned public space. But on the other hand, it doesn't really do what it promises to do. And
the people who squatted the tower were partly then the clients of the center or not?
Some of the women were part of that, and they were very much part of so there's always a downtown east side march for the right to housing. And the Downtown East Side Women's Center is one of the organizers for the Right to Housing March every year. So they were part of the larger, what is called the DTES community. They were not the ones who squatted. I mean, there might have been one or two who were part of that, but they were part of, the processes, I think we know, they happen in very similar cycles. So the people who live in a rundown area are not the ones who live there after it has been beautified or updated, if you will.
Well, yeah. So, as I see it, your exhibitions are like mostly documentary, but not just documentary, because you're not just telling the story of the people and the places, but you are like being part of it. So it's, for me, as I see it, it's sort of like opening of the box with shredding cat, because you sometimes you may be just the episode of the story, but sometimes you can be part of making a plot. So if it is your purpose or just a side effect of it?
To become part of the plot?
Yeah.
Well, I think you're always implied in the plot, whether you want it or not. I guess the question is, how far can one go to consciously influence towards a certain perspective? And I guess the involvement you're pointing to, it varies in many different degrees. So you could say with the women of the Downtown East Side Women's Center, it was very involved in order to become part of what their story is. Hands-on urbanism is a lot less involved in that sense. It's a lot more like quote-unquote classical field research, urban research, documenting, trying to bring together the different forces of urbanization that are neither nor. I mean, neither just policy making nor just bottom-up, but that there is a constant back and forth between the two of them. So you could say it's a lot more analytical or theory-driven than the Vancouver project. And I think being part of it happens on many levels. I guess you cannot ever not be part of it. But I think there's a lot of curatorial positions that would claim to not be part of it.
So what is like when you are just a part of your life, you are living by this, by some topic. So what is it like just after it left it behind and do something other?
You mean how do you leave behind your old projects?
Yeah.
It's hard. It's very hard. I mean, a lot of the things I do could go on, many could go on for years.
Yeah, because of course when there's something about your neighborhood, so it's still you just can't. But when you're making projects on some really places which are really like distance from, so you physically have to leave it, and like how is it starting something new? If you're
well, I think intellectually it's necessary to do new things, and also I think it's kind of nobody is irreplaceable. If somebody stops working somewhere, somebody else at some point will come and do other work that is equally meaningful and equally important. So that's on a very, let's say, interhuman perspective, I would argue like that. On a more what drives a body of work perspective, how do you envision your work as a curator to become more than one exhibition? I think over time it's issues one opens, and I guess these issues, they also change with the conditions of present age, of what we call the contemporary. I guess what I aim for is to address issues that are relevant at a certain point in time. So I did very different things in the 1990s from the things I do now, to answer your question. I think there's something that I would call time specificity. So a lot of contemporary art practices in the 1960s and 1970s were theorized under this rubric of site specificity, that one would work with a given site, and it could be the material conditions or the emotional conditions. But I think there's also something that one specifically addresses the issues of the time we are part of, and I guess that's what drives my work, if I look at it over, like the last 25 years.
I would like to ask how exactly were you able to stop working at the project in your neighborhood? Because I don't know, probably it would be impossible because you are still in touch with all these things.
Yeah, it's most difficult. I mean, I absolutely agree.
Are you still doing it? Or?
At the moment, I'm just living there. I'm not doing anything there at the moment. But I think it's...
Do you still think about it, like if you could move the project somewhere else?
Yeah, I think I'd be ready 5 years from now to try out something new, something different, something that might be relevant in 5 years. So it's I'm not saying it's over, but I think it did something at the time it was necessary to address a certain, let's say, period in the life of the street. And I think there's nothing worse than projects that are kept alive just for the sake of being kept alive. So I think it's both. I mean, it's emotionally hard to let go, but I think it's also necessary sometimes to cut.
Do you do it on your own, or does do you need somebody to tell you, like, you need to stop now?
Oh, that's a very personal question. No?
I mean, for me, it seems like that, and you usually need somebody to tell you you should move on and do something else.
I wish I had someone like that. No, I don't think anybody ever told me that you have to move on. I mean, I think doing an exhibition is a lot easier because it's very much like a piece of architecture. It has a life of its own after the opening. So it's like you complete a building and the people move in, or the people start to use it. So another part of its history begins. And I think it's the same is true for an exhibition. So that has very much a dynamic of you deliver. And everything is like, you work and work and work for the opening. So it has this kind of dynamic. But if you work as an urban curator in the street, you work like this, a lot more meandering. You do something and it becomes public, and then for a while you don't do anything, and then you do something again. So I think it has a lot more the cycle of urban time rather than architectural production time.
Do you think that the exhibition actually can influence something? In the exhibition itself?
It depends on the exhibition, I would say. Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the past, like architectural exhibitions, let's say the deconstructivist exhibition at MoMA, none of the people who were in it had built anything. And now they are the people who built everything. So you could say, for better or for worse, that was a turning point in their careers. So I think if I look at the history of architecture exhibitions, there are some that were extremely important for the architects that were exhibited. I think another research would be what was impacted apart from architectural production. And I guess there's a lot of exhibitions that don't have that impact, but that doesn't mean that they were not important.
Maybe can I ask you about you said that running is let me rephrase you. I don't know if this will be the exact words you said, but maybe it wasn't like that. But I had a feeling that you said that you are a little bit skeptical about the visual thinking, which is part of contemporary urban garden movement. Why are you skeptical about what it can really do, what it can really achieve?
I guess I'm not skeptical of the actual effects it has. I think I'm skeptical of the ideology that comes with it, that we will save the world with urban gardening, or that we will make the world a better place. I mean, I'm not saying we are making the world a worse place with urban gardening, but I think that, so Doina Petrescu, who is French architect, who together with Constantin Petcu established AAA, Atelier d'Architecture Autogérée. They were part of the Hands-on Urbanism exhibition also. And she once wrote about, she's very much influenced by Hart and Negri, and they're close friends. And she once wrote that the making of the garden is the equivalent of the making of the community around the garden. So the social relations that come into being via gardening are just as important as the garden itself. And as much as I think that this is important, I think it's also a dilemma that what does it mean that all the gardeners have to become a community? I guess what I'm very doubtful about is the community in community gardening and what that actually means and who is part of these communities and who is not. And a lot of cities, including Vienna, has discovered urban gardening as a means to set up intercultural gardens and to mediate tensions or conflicts between different people of different countries of origin. So again, I'm not saying that I don't like what's happening in these gardens, but the way it's framed, that this is what has to happen when you garden together, I think that's the part I find difficult.
I mean, it's the same with the architecture actually. I mean, it's a little bit similar to the plans that are being made of the building, and that you, I guess, you try to, I mean, the plans of the architect, of the municipality about the building, that is communal, that it's just or whatever, and I mean, the building itself cannot work as a machine for justice or for communal thing, but it's also the social structure of what we are trying to do. Does it work the same with the architecture? I guess the social structure is similarly important as the building itself.
Yeah, but I think they are not determining each other. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. The garden is neither good nor bad. And also the Woodwards building is neither good nor bad, but there can be measures of design built into it that allow for things and exclude others. But there could also be other measures you can take, after a building like this comes into being that makes it community accessible. So I think in one of the store windows there, it now says the community shops here. But of course the community doesn't shop here. The community of shoppers is a different community than the community living around it. So I guess but that doesn't mean that it could not have happened. I guess what I'm trying to say is that on one hand, there are inbuilt measures of design that specifically keep people out. But I'm also saying they're not that strong that they couldn't be overcome if people decided collectively to use it differently. And I guess the same thing I try to say about the garden. As much as I'm in favor of the right to green, and otherwise I wouldn't have called my exhibition that, I'm not glorifying the garden movement as something that produces better human beings. And that's very often much the kind of I don't like to use the word, but the kind of propaganda around it, or the kind of marketing, if you will. And I think I can produce a checklist, what these gardens have to have in order to receive funding. I mean, it's very easy. You have to have an educational program, you have to have opportunity for civic engagement, you have to address different age groups, you have to have specific events for immigrants, you have to maybe rent out the garden, you have to have a cafe where the homegrown things are being cooked seasonally. So, I could, and you can tick the checkbox. And I think this is what I find quite spooky. And there's a lot of new vertical gardens in New York that actually do exactly that. I mean, the community gardens on the ground, the people are being evicted. But then there are new urban gardens on rooftops, and they do exactly what I just said. They provide opportunities for community engagement. But that's something else from a community instituting itself. And I guess it's this differentiation that I find still important to make within gardens. They are not the same, so to put it simple.
Do you think that the urban gardens will last long enough to make some real influence on the society structure maybe? Isn't it just a fashion of few years, like in the past people used to make a lot of like in the romanticism, you know, they made like the fake castles and having adventure in it and having picnics and this, and it was just fashion, and some people still like do it, something similar, but it's not some main or some most common thing. And urban gardening like is now, or it's starting to be. But you think it will last long enough to?
I don't know. It's a very good question to ask. I mean, I think a lot of the issues that are embedded in it are a lot larger than each individual garden. I mean, it's really what is at stake is how do we see cities of the future negotiate the rural and the urban? And what does it mean that a lot of the countryside is actually depleted? There is a lot of dying villages or shrinking villages. And on the other hand, processes of urbanization integrate more and more how you have local food production on a larger scale. So I think the whole, how we think what used to be called the rural and the urban is the big question for the future. So thinking through the lens of the garden allows one, I mean, that would be one of a next project I could envision to do. So I looked at urbanization for a very long time. So what does it mean to look at villages in their interrelatedness with the urban? And I think the garden would allow me to look at that, or the urban farming. So I think it's extremely relevant. And I also believe fashions are not just fashions. I mean, they always function on a material and symbolic order. And when they are needed, there is reasons why they come into being. And I guess I couldn't really provide a global answer to your question, because I think gardening has very different reasons in very different places of the world.
I would like to ask you if you could compare a little bit the American ways to European ways, because you work both in the United States and Europe. It would seem to me that people in America actually create communities, and they are capable of initiative and creating ideas and put them into practice. Though in Europe, or perhaps just in Czech, or I don't know, people are or tend to be very passive and concerning the very privately, the space that concerns them, they are not creative, and they just people here are used to project developers and designs that concern the place regularly, but they usually cannot come up with their own ideas to improve them. And I think Americans perhaps are different in this, they are actually capable to come up with such a scheme with some new ideas to actually improve the place. So,
I don't know. I mean, if you look at the state of urbanization in a lot of North American cities, I guess I prefer to live on this side of the Atlantic. So I find that a very difficult question to answer. I guess if I understand correctly, the creativity you're asking for or you would like to see coming into being, from my understanding, very oftentimes it comes into being when it's necessary. But that's my reading of this. So if the crisis is big enough or the pressure is really forcefully impacting on lives, then people will always act. But if it's not necessary to act, then, but that's a very, very general question and a very general answer. And I don't think I would share such a general, people here are like this and people there are like that. I guess I would come back to what I said before about time. I think when things change over time, then also what human beings do changes very much. I mean, if we look at what happens in Athens at the moment or in Lisbon, there are enormous acts of solidarity of people who 5 years ago would never have thought of writing handbooks based on collective legal knowledge against evictions, because it wasn't necessary to think about that, because the situation didn't require it. I mean, maybe that's not an answer to your question, but I find it difficult in a way to, maybe there is a yearning that you would like it to be different elsewhere. And I guess places are always different from each other. The question for me would be, what can you do with your desire, How can that impact on what you do here? I think this is what I would try to understand better, or to make it work in a productive way that is not so frustrating, because I hear kind of frustration.
So it's very, from my point of view, it's very easy our perspective to check. But this is what I see in general way that people are generally very passive and they don't care for their
I mean, do you all see it like this? I mean, do you share your colleagues?
Because when I hear you talking about what people do in the world, and perhaps not just America, all over the world, I don't see many parallels in Czech to such activities. I think that there's there's not so many of these activities, but if you're looking how it rates, so it rates really quickly. So
you're catching up, but I think we are still just mirroring the actions.
But it's like, okay, well, a lot of, you had a point that a lot of people are passive, and I think that is true. But if you think, and I mean not exactly if someone thinks it's wrong, which I am not sure if anybody has the right to say it's wrong. But if you really think it, and you're really convinced by it, you also change it. It's not so hard to make active people from passive people if you have the will, if you really try. And I think that if somebody is really convinced that it's better to be active than passive, so this is the way how, it's like you are maybe true, but it's not like something what can't be checked. Yeah, so it's not like the definite. It's like really, for me it's really easy. I think it's quite easy to do it. Or maybe not easy for everyone, but it's possible. It's nothing impossible. So I maybe
also,
now
I think it's very general to say active in what sense?
Yeah.
I mean, those people are active, they are living their lives, you know, they are not sitting passively on a chair, so they are active in a certain sense, but in what sense you mean that the people are active, publicly active, or trying to like make some political statements about their city, trying to active in the sense of the rights to the city? Or?
Yeah. People, I think people, the residents are usually only complaining about what happens in their environment, and if when they have a problem with something, they don't do anything but complain and then just track. Okay, so that we don't like it.
I think it's changing more last years. Society is waking up. If you see some public actions last years, for example in Brno, or some public civic activists, what they are doing, I think it's waking up.
I also think, yeah, people are complaining more, but I don't think it has to be that they really are like not happy with the situation. I think a lot of people complain just because they like want to talk about something, and complaining is always some topic of conversation. I think that's I don't think that so many people are really with the situation. And that's it. We are living, but I think that we are living in the bubble of people who are living quite similar lives. So maybe they are fine with whatever it is.
Would you now space for the last question if there is one? No, maybe the train leaves at. No, I just wanted to make a statement that if the train leaves at 10, then we can.
No, before 21, 22. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's time.
Okay, there is still time for getting beer or whatever. Anyone wants to come, then maybe we can go for a beer and continue discussion because such a day. So, okay, I would like to thank Elke for an exciting lecture.
Well, thank you for having me.
And what do you prefer to doing? Because if there, okay, perhaps we will go to Regal. So if there is anyone who wants to join us, then to make a company to Elke until the train, then you can join us.